So today we're going to talk about the last survey section before we move on to the focus of the study. And today we're looking at the impact of the of apartheid on rural and urban communities. So basically, as you can pretty much imagine, if you were non-white in South Africa, life was pretty difficult, whether you were in an urban or rural area. They both had issues, but depending on if you were living in a township or living on a Bantustan, there were differences in what you had to deal with. But even so, there were shared experiences of poverty, homelessness, poor health, and poor education. And this is because from 1948, the increased segregation, the varying laws, the caste system, and the creation of Bantustans made life increasingly difficult. And we'll get to those as we move through. So, in terms of just dealing with facts and figures, okay, if you look at the population on the right-hand side, now we've looked at this graph and this map before, but we didn't look at it in this way. If you look at 1960, 19.3% of the population, were white, and almost 70% of the population were African or black. But if you look at the map on the left, the kind of mauvey area is the bulk of South Africa. And so you basically had 19% of the population living on approximately 80% of the land. And that means you've got almost 70% of the African, with the population of blacks, living in those Bantustans and reserves and Lesotho and so forth. So we can already see that just in terms of geography, that there's going to be enormous disparity between the living standards. So the whites are going to have all this land, and of course it's going to be all the prime land, it's going to be all the best land. And if you notice, most of the land is coastal land. And a lot of the areas, that were given to the blacks are in areas which were next to the Kalahari Desert and so forth. And we'll get on to those specifics later on. So in terms of the impact on urban communities, what we see developing throughout the 50s and 60s is the idea of influx control. Now remember that in the first video, in survey 1, we looked at, because of the Great Depression and World War II, there was a massive influx of blacks into the townships, which of course freaked the white people out. And so what we see happening from 1948 onwards is an attempt to decrease this population and manage this population influx. And this was done through influx control. So they pushed out a lot of the black workers to the Bantustans with the Bantustan Act in 1959 and the continuing development of the Bantustans. And remember that every African male over 16 had to carry a DOM pass with his passport, and it had to be signed off by your employer. It had to be dated, had to have your date of birth, it had to have your criminal record, all that sort of stuff. In case if you didn't have it, or it wasn't completely up to date, the police were able to arrest you, imprison you, or send you back to your Bantustan. And we'll look at why that might be a problem a little bit later on. From 1956, every African female over 16 also had to have one of these. And so this made it increasingly difficult for African women to get employment. And when they did get employment, it meant that they were separated from their families. And so, and again, we'll talk about that as we move ahead. The influx control was also used to stop blacks squatting illegally in towns and to stop movement, but this failed because when you lived on a Bantustan or in a township, the only way to survive was to farm or to find work. Farming wasn't really going to happen because of the terrible land that they were generally put on, and so they had to go and find work, which meant that they were willing to kind of squat illegally, move around illegally to try and get work so that they could support their families. And so what the South African government did then, to make sure that there was a supply of black labour close by but not too close, was to set up townships outside the cities to prevent mixing. For example, Soweto was established, and if you look at the letters of Soweto, it's actually short for South West Township, SO South WE West and TO Township. So, we see these sort of established townships to manage the black population, to ensure that they're not living in the cities, and to make sure that they still have a supply of black factory workers and so forth. In terms of the townships, they were often severely under-resourced and overcrowded, and they had very little infrastructures to support them. Some towns were destroyed, and we've talked about this Sophia town, which was named Triumph or Triumph in Afrikaans, and District 6 in Cape Town, and there were others. On to the left there, you can actually see a house from Triumph in the 1980s. And as you can see, it's very suburban. It's very, when you look at the locations of Sophia Town and Cape Town, they were like embedded within those, those cities. And of course, you can't have blacks living in white cities. And so they had to be relocated. And they forcibly relocated some 3.5 million South African blacks to rural homelands between 1960 and 1980. And the land that was left behind was taken over by whites who bought it at greatly reduced prices if they paid at all. The thing is, when we look at urban issues, like when we look at all the laws, some laws affected urban populations more, some laws affected rural populations more. Some of the laws that affected the urban areas where there was more mixing of blacks and whites was the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act and the Immorality Act. And there's an example there of Dr. John Blacking and Dr. Zarina Desai, who were forced to leave in 1969 because they fell in love. Really cool story though, just a little bit of backstory about Dr. John Blacking. He was actually born in England and had travelled to South Africa because he was really interested in the idea of music and what music tells us about our history, our culture, our language. And he wrote this seminal work, Is Music for Man, and looking at how the South African tribes used music to communicate culture and identity and history. And he met up with a young medical student, Zarina Desai. She was his second wife, and they had to leave. And a fun fact about Zarina Desai, her mum was actually a mate of Nelson Mandela's and started out in the African National Congress. There was also the Bantu Education Act, which meant that blacks would receive a far inferior education. And this was even worse in rural areas where there wasn't as much money and it was harder to access teachers. In terms of urban workers, the South African economy boomed from the 1950s onwards, and so foreign investors were keen to take advantage of the low wages for black workers, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move ahead. And black factory workers earned 20% of their white counterparts, so from the get-go they're going to be disadvantaged. There was also the lack of housing meant crowded, unhygienic conditions. And it's interesting though, one of the problems we have with Black South Africa is the lack of sources because the whites weren't really interested in keeping records about the blacks. And so anecdotally we hear stories of living in a house of up to 18 people, 2 to 3 families sharing the same area. And it calls to mind, when you would have done the Romanovs, like living conditions in the cities in Russia in the early 19th century. But this is happening, in the 20th century, in the 1950s, 60s, 70s. It's crazy. Police patrol the borders between the black and white townships. And if you were seen to be transgressing the border, then you could be violently punished. And again, you could be imprisoned or you'd be sent back to a Bantustan. And the thing is, even if you were earning a decent wage in the town, you couldn't really spend it on yourself or do nice things because a lot of the time you were sending money back to your family in a Bantustan to help support them, or you were saving because blacks didn't get pensions in South Africa. And so you needed to make sure that if you did make it to the pension age, and we'll talk about life expectancy a bit later on, then the chances were that you would have to support yourself. In terms of rural then, the number of Bantustan towns increased from 3 in 1960 to 77 in 1970. And the population in those places rose from 4.4 million to 11 million in 20 years. So that shows just how committed the government were to decolonising the towns, if you like, of blacks and moving them out into those areas. And also we do see an increased birth rate, but that's because of the close proximity and all sorts of other issues that are going on. But we will talk about the birth rate as we move ahead as well. The thing is that remember these Bantustans were sort of like independent states, and that's because South Africa didn't want to be responsible really for blacks, and they didn't want blacks to have a say in government or in anything that was going on. So by making them citizens of these independent states, it meant that the black South Africans were basically migrant workers when they went into the townships or when they went to other places for work. But within the Bantustans themselves, they were ruled by local elites who had tribal authority endorsed by the national government. Some rulers were corrupt, some were not, but they all benefited financially. And what we see happening is a local stratification. And the white government was happy to do this because keeping the local leadership friendly, and this is very similar to what the Romans did, the Persians did. You keep the local elites happy and they do the dirty work for you. The guy you can see there is actually a guy called Kaiser Matanzima, and he was actually really good mates with Nelson Mandela until he became the ruler of his this township, and they kind of saw things differently. But this guy was actually Nelson Mandela's best man at his first wedding, and they continued to be friends until Mantanzima died. Um, but the thing, and he actually spoke out about against apartheid, so he wasn't one of the corrupt ones. But as you can imagine, being bribed by the whites to stay in power, to keep your position of power, you developed a bureaucracy around you to protect that source of power. And we see that happening particularly, say, for example, in Transkei, which was one of the original three areas. In 1963, there were 2,446 government officials, but by 1980, there were over 20,000 who were all paid well above workers' wages. For example, a local worker was paid around 169 Rand a month in about 1970, and that's about 150 Australian dollars. Okay, so in present day. Okay, so that's what the historical conversion rate is. But an official could be paid up to 1,000 Rand per month, which means, you could be paid 15,000 per month as an official in modern day Australian terms. So you can see the wage disparity there is quite enormous. Teachers were also paid well, and they were black teachers, and they were reasonably well educated, but they had to reinforce the South African white curriculum. Thing is, with the education system, and we'll talk a little bit more about this as we move on. Sorry, I keep on saying that, but we will get there. Because the South African government didn't, due to the Bantu education laws, didn't want children to be terribly well educated, this was going to come back to bite them eventually because it meant that they weren't developing enough teachers, doctors, nurses, lawyers, dentists who could actually support the black South African population. And we'll see how that impacts on health as we go ahead. In terms of economic impacts, because the blacks were often forced to live in isolated areas on the edge of urban areas, this dramatically increased the cost of commuting. So if you're a black South African worker, you could actually commute for up to 6 hours a day on buses, etc., getting to your place of work. And of course, you had to pay for that. The white factories aren't going to pay for you to go there. The white mines aren't going to pay for you to go there. So you had to basically pay to go to work to earn enough to eke out a living, in your homeland. It also meant that there was low levels of funding for education. We've talked about that in the first video, that basically they spent 1/10 of the amount that they would spend on a white child on a black child in terms of their education. And this, as I said before, would have impacts on areas such as health. There was also no infrastructure. So, it meant that locals were forced to purchase goods from these small little general stores, which charged much higher rates. It's like when you go, if you go for we can't do that at the moment, but when you go on a road trip and you get outside Sydney and you go into those small towns, like petrol's more expensive, milk's more expensive. And you know why? Because, all the transport costs of getting those products in, and it means you don't have as wide a range. So it means that, you can't, if you can farm, great, but most Bantustans didn't really have arable farming land, and there was also issues regard to how much land you could access. And then you can't access a wide range of consumer goods or even food goods, like, actually edible goods, which means that from the get-go, you're behind nutrition-wise as well. And the thing too is that the South African government realised that there were opportunities to further exploit these Bantustans, and so white businesses were offered incentives to invest in Bantustans. For example, Sun City, and you can see that this is the revamped Sun City. But Sun City, amongst others, was this like crazy luxury resort that was built up in the north, one of the northeastern Bantustans. I'm sorry, I can't pronounce the name, and I feel really bad. But and it became because the Bantustans could offer something that South Africa couldn't, and that was gambling and raunchy review shows and so forth. So these became like, and because they were close to some of the big towns in South Africa, these became like really famous resorts. International stars would come and play at the resorts, and then just so you drive in through these shanty towns, and then you met with all this luxury. So it's very similar to what's happened in Las Vegas in America as well. The thing is too that if you were relocated, so say if you're someone from Sophiatown or District 6 or one of the other towns, when you were relocated to a Bantustan or a township, you only received a small house plot, if you were lucky, 50 metres square with a tin hut and a latrine, and you needed to pay rent to local tribal authorities. And the thing is, like when people were relocated, they weren't really relocated back to what was their historical tribal entity. They were actually just placed anywhere randomly that the white authorities felt you should go. And don't forget, a lot of these were really highly urbanised blacks who'd lived their entire lives in cities, and now they're being sent out to eke out a living farming on as you can see, in landscapes that won't do anything. So, it's like taking you as a Loreto Kirribilli girl and dumping you over in Uluru with the Midujulu peoples and expecting you to make a go of it. I'm sure you could. But the idea that also, if you went there, that land ownership was determined by your local chieftains. Remember those guys running the Bantustan for the government, and so depending on what you could bribe them with or how they felt about you, decided how much land you got and where you got it. And the thing is too that many workers had to commute daily for work. I talked about that earlier. So it meant that if I'm a mum and I'm a maid in Johannesburg, I don't see my children except maybe once a month, once every 3 months. There are stories of children travelling to visit their parents or their mums at their houses, and because one of the children is still sick, and the mum not being allowed to go back because someone's got a dinner party on. It sounds sort of like something out of 19th century's pre-Civil War America, but the same thing was happening here. And so you had extended families looking after children like grandparents, aunties, while workers would move to the city or travel to the city to work and then send the money back and so forth. But interestingly enough, I was reading this article by a guy called Abel, who wrote it in 2015. While initially there was a lot of conflict and violence at the outset of these townships and these Bantustans, over time there were higher levels of social capital. That means trust and working together, and less crime due to this diversity. Because remember that these towns weren't all made up of the same tribes. They were made up from ethnically diverse black tribes from across South Africa, and they were all placed in the one place together. So, of course, at the beginning, there's a lot of culture clashing. But as time goes on, they learn to work together because they realise solidarity is the only way that's going to get them through. And this is a message that's, espoused also by Biko and Mandela. So in terms of health, like this isn't specifically mentioned in the syllabus, but I thought it was interesting to look at because this is something that affects both rural and urban communities. And across what we see is 1 in 4 children dying before the age of 1. A lot of the time that is due to birth conditions and also being born prematurely. In 1948, the life expectancy for a black man was 38 years as opposed to a white male, which was 62. Now, in 1978, the life expectancy had raised to 52 years for black and 65 for white. So you might think, well, that they're making progress, but you would hope so. But even so, 52 and still 13 years younger than a white. And a lot of those years are going to be pretty damn hard. And remember too, I was saying about saving for, your retirement. It almost seems kind of pointless because unless you're really lucky, you're not going to make it. Also, the black rate of death from tuberculosis, which doesn't really even occur in most of the known world these days, infection, parasites was 15 times higher than for white people. Particularly if you're a miner, you were susceptible to tuberculosis as well as, oh, damn it, I've forgotten the word, the oh, damn it, I'll think of it later and tell you. But miners was particularly susceptible to a lot of these things. Also, the idea that infection, you get a cut, it gets dirt, you get infection, you die. Horrifying, because that could just be dealt with through simple hygiene, antibiotics, etc. So this tells us that in South Africa, the black Bantustans and townships had nowhere near the same level of hygiene or access to healthcare as the white community did. Children would often also die from malnutrition. It was quite a big scandal in the 60s. And the government tried to combat this through the provision of milk powder. Problem is, remember, running water, safe running water, big issue in South Africa. So even if you did have the milk powder, you've only got, polluted water, if enough water at all, to feed it to your child. And also through school food programs. But remember that 10-to-1 funding ratio, that included food as well. Also, just the last thing, and remember that education thing we talked about earlier about not educating enough black children to grow up to become doctors, nurses, teachers, what have you, because white people couldn't treat black people and black people couldn't treat white people. So to get the kind of education you needed, to become a doctor was very, very difficult. Some of the Christian and Catholic communities set up these mission schools, but these were discouraged from apartheid because we don't want to educate them too well. Nelson Mandela benefited from one of the mission schools, but also life in some of those mission schools could be incredibly difficult due to abuse. But the physician population ratio in 1975, so that means how many doctors to how many people. For whites, it was 1 to 400, so 1 doctor to 400. But for a black person, it was 1 doctor to 40,000 black Africans. So that gives you a sense of just how disadvantaged the black community were, both in urban and rural areas. So we've looked at a few things. So we need to consider the economic, the fact that they, were restricted to lower paid jobs, paid 1/5 of what regular people were paid. Their housing there was no new housing built during apartheid, essentially. So they had to fabricate their own houses out of corrugated iron, cardboard, whatever they could find. Very little infrastructure, very little economic input into these areas, high rate of corruption. But despite all this, what we see is a sense of community building, which is going to come back to bite the South African government in the end. But just while we're thinking about apartheid, yes, it does talk about the impact on rural and urban communities, but that also means the white rural and urban communities. The thing is that the white South Africans experienced one of the highest standards of living in the world during this time, so during the 50s, 60s, 70s, because there was a boom during the 60s, coupled with the rise of the price of gold and cheap black labour. We've got De Beers diamonds, got all this sort of stuff happening, meant that that most whites were really well off, even the poorer ones, because even if you were a poorer Afrikaner, it meant that you had guaranteed employment, you were going to be paid more than your black counterpart. Remember, blacks weren't allowed to have trades union to get themselves better conditions, so you were always going to be better off. Also, in terms of international investment, we see that really increasing during apartheid. So we have Ford Motors, they're a car company, General Electric, electricity company, Coca-Cola, IBM, Mobil. They are all heavily investing in South Africa because the return in the 1970s was 19.1% compared with a global return of 11%. So it was worth your money. You basically got, for every dollar you spent, you got $5 back. So it's pretty good. I just sort of show you here, I've just realised with this picture you can't actually see what these girls are holding, but these are girls at a, girls just like you, attending an independent girls' school in South Africa in the 1960s, and they are doing shooting target practice because you never know when you're going to be attacked, either by a black person or a lion in South Africa, and so you need to be able to shoot properly. So it's kind of like, the Army Cadets program, but with hats. So that's the impact of apartheid on rural and urban communities. Looking forward to seeing you all very soon, and we'll continue our study in South Africa this week.